Hi, HLC families. Today I'm going to share with you some of the information that was covered in a recent parent information night regarding sex education and talking to your kids about sexual health, safety, relationships, and all of those topics. I'm actually going to break this into two videos for sake of time. This one will be general tips and tricks for how to talk to your kids about these topics. And then in my next video, I will share with you something called the RISE model, which is a step-by-step process for how to kind of navigate challenging questions that may come to you from your children. So sex education can obviously be a tricky topic that can fill parents with a lot of emotions, especially when you think about it relating to your own kids, and particularly more so when you have a child that may have some of the social skill deficits, relationship boundary issues, or just difficulty reading, emotional or body language cues from other people that we tend to see amongst individuals on the autism spectrum. You may think that your child isn't even interested in dating or romance or any of that. But honestly, there really isn't any evidence that people on the autism spectrum are any more likely to be asexual than the rest of the population. And even if that is the case, a lot of people who identify as asexual are still interested in emotional, romantic relationships, even if they're not really interested in the physical aspect. What may look like a lack of interest amongst your child might actually really stem from maybe social skill deficits that make it hard for them to even talk to or approach somebody that they might think is interesting or attractive. If your child does the bulk of their socializing here at school, we don't have a very large population here, and we do also have a really large gender gap. Not that relationships are only, between men and women, but we just don't have as many opportunities to interact with the opposite sex if that is what your child is particularly interested in. And then also maybe just conversational skill deficits that they may want to come and ask you and talk to you, because children are more likely to want to seek this information from somebody they trust, like a parent or a guardian, but they might not even know how to go about starting to talk to you about it. Some of you may think, well, honestly, my child sort of operates on a younger cognitive level. I can't even envision them starting to think about these sorts of adult topics. And, for some, that very well may be true. But regardless of an individual's cognitive level, everyone is still people in traditionally, typically developing bodies. So if you have, a teenager on the autism spectrum, while they may seem more interested in, say, Paw Patrol than going on a date, their body is still going through all the same changes of puberty. They're experiencing all the same hormones, a lot of the same emotions and stimulatory responses that their non-disabled peers have. So one's cognitive level doesn't necessarily mean that their body doesn't follow the typical progression of development. At the end of it all, every individual has a right to understand their own body, to know how it works, to know what kind of changes you're going through as you develop, and how to keep yourself healthy and safe. Additionally, the desire to love other people and to be loved in return is a universal individual right. And on a really unfortunate note, if we're being honest, individuals with disabilities, particularly those with intellectual disabilities, are far more likely to be victims of sexual abuse than the non-disabled population. And a lot of times this stems from a lack of knowledge and a lack of knowing what to do when put into particular situations. So all of these and more are really good reasons about why it's very important to talk to your kids about their bodies, about healthy relationships, about sexual health and safety. Giving them this knowledge does not necessarily mean that you are condoning them to go out and start, having contact with all sorts of different people. What it does mean is you are giving them important information to help them live happy, healthy, and safe lives. All right, so let's talk about some tools and tips for teaching sexual and relationship health and safety to your kids. All right, so the first suggestion is use your tools. So any existing tools that you already use to help your child with other skills oftentimes can be modified to cover these sorts of topics. Things like visual schedules, social stories, checklists can all be adapted. Whether they're related to sort of personal hygiene routines with that, or just broader story-based type things. There's also a lot of educational videos and books out there. However, I do highly recommend that these are best done when you sit down with your child and read or watch it together and discuss, as opposed to, you know, just giving them a book and saying, all right, go read this and learn, which is probably how a lot of us learned. Not necessarily the best method. Also, things that you guys already enjoy consuming together, like television, movies, and also, honestly, in the news lately, there's been a lot of stories that could be great starting points for conversations. You know, say, for example, you're sitting down with your child and you guys are watching The Big Bang Theory, and, you know, you might turn to them and go, hey, you know, what do you think about the way, you know, Sheldon is treating Amy in this scene? Like, do you think that's a nice way to treat somebody that you care about? That sort of thing. I also have a variety of print materials if you feel like you need some help finding resources with this. Feel free to reach out to me. Next suggestion is be proactive. It is always better to start earlier rather than later, because being caught off guard by perhaps a behavior or even just a question can sometimes make the process more challenging. You can start even if you have a very young child. You can begin just teaching them about their body parts, about public and private spaces and behaviors, and so on. Typically, developing children can begin to start displaying some, you know, masturbatory-like self-stimulatory behaviors as early as 7 or 8. And, you know, it's always best to start talking about bodily changes before puberty sets in. So it's always good to try to address those topics earlier rather than later. And if you have an older student, well, let me tell you, now is the time. I just sat through sex ed sessions with our students, and there was a really good question and answer session, and a lot of our students had really good questions. So I can tell you for a fact that many of them are indeed curious and want to learn more, not necessarily just about sex, but also about healthy relationships as well. So, you know, if you haven't started yet, I suggest go ahead and start trying to begin that process. Next, we have inform. This is the most important part. You know, your child may catch you off guard with a question, or they may ask you something that immediately makes you want to go, why do you want to know that? What are you up to? But try to check that response, because again, if they're trying to come to you to ask, they're trying to gather information. And then the important part that you have here is you can make sure that the information that they get is, you know, it's factual, it's accurate, it's safe, and it's with their health in mind. You know, as opposed to, you know, they can go try to find stuff on the internet, but that might not be the best route. It is really strongly suggested that you use medical terminology when discussing body parts. You know, people on the spectrum oftentimes have trouble with euphemisms or with, you know, trying to talk around a topic rather than just being direct with it. And additionally, it has been found that, you know, individuals that have a strong understanding and comfort with the terminology and the vocabulary of their body, if something should happen to them, they are more likely to report the abuse because they are able to go and talk about what happened to them in clear, accurate terms. You know, if this is tough for you, I understand that sometimes using some of these anatomical words make people uncomfortable, but I highly recommend maybe practicing with your spouse, a friend, a partner, you know, so you can try to get used to and get comfortable with talking about those things in very frank, direct language, because that will be much more beneficial for your child than, you know, well, when two people love each other and they want to have a baby, you know, they da-da-da-da-da, and that's how it happens. It's not the best, not necessarily the best approach to take. Teach bathroom safety. This might seem a little odd, especially if you have an older student, but the bathroom is an intimate place that people can be very exposed in. And it is really important to do clear instruction about how to be safe, particularly in public bathrooms. You know, maybe going in and looking around to see, are you the only person in there? And if not, you know, who else is in there? Where are they at? Making sure your stall door is locked. Talking to young men about these sort of hidden rules of using urinals, or, you know, letting them know that they have the option of using a stall if they prefer. You know, Also making sure to help your student have independent toileting and showering skills can be particularly important if you have a child who may, as an adult, spend time like living in a group home or in a day facility where if they don't have these skills, they may be in situations in which they're being assisted by staff. And I'm not saying anything bad about staff at these places. However, if you can reduce the amount of opportunities that your child has to be alone in a potentially compromising situation, they're nude, whatever, with other adults, just the less opportunities that has to happen, the less likely that something bad could happen. I hope that makes sense. Next, talking about touch, different kinds of touch. For a long time, the narrative was traditionally talking about good touch and bad touch. But now we try to talk more about phrasing it in terms of safe touch, unsafe touch, and unwanted touch. And the reason for this is sometimes when we say good and bad, bad touch being associated with touching that happens in your private areas, your bathing suit areas. When you associate that kind of touch with bad touching, then that tends to create a negative association with any kind of touching with that. We don't want to shame or stigmatize, intimate touching when it's done positively and when it's done with consent. So preferably stick with safe, unsafe, and unwanted. Any kind of touch can go from being a safe touch to an unwanted touch, which then can become an unsafe touch. Additionally, we have talked about the next tip is meet them where they are at. For kids who may have a hard time, with things like eye contact, for kids who, you suspect that this conversation might be a little challenging for them. A lot of times trying to have the conversation in a less confrontational than a let's sit down and talk about this kind of fashion can be helpful. So maybe you're dropping them off at school and you guys talk about it in the car, and then you're kind of parallel to each other. You're not sitting and looking at each other, can be a little less intimidating. Maybe you're helping make dinner together one day, or again, you're just kind of hanging out on the couch watching a movie. All of those can be more casual places to, and ways to talk about these topics with them. Additionally, maybe try discussing what if scenarios. So if it's maybe your first time sitting down and talking with, your female child about menstruation and things like that, you might, talk to them about, so what if you get your period while you're at school? What do we do? Trying to talk about some of those what if scenarios before can help, with the pressure of trying to figure out how to solve the problem in the moment when everything is really intense and emotional. If you talk about it ahead of time, they might already have a plan in place. And then finally, stay connected to their feelings. Again, you might not necessarily think they're very interested, but you also might notice them talking about a particular peer at school a lot. And you might say, hey, I've heard you mention so-and-so several times. Tell me a little bit more about them. What do you like about them? What do you think is interesting? So trying to pay attention to, what they're expressing and responding appropriately can be really helpful. So these are my tips today. I'm going to follow up with a few videos here, one with the RISE model and one going more in depth about how to talk to your kids about consent. So stay tuned. Hope you're having a great day and stay healthy.